Every tactic used by the German army in World War II. May 10, 1940. French officers stood along the Meuse River, confident in their defenses. Behind them stretched the Maginot Line, declared impregnable by their generals. Before them lay the Ardennes forest, terrain their intelligence said was impassable for armor. Then the panzers appeared. German forces crossed the Meuse at Sedan within 48 hours. Within a week, they had driven a steel wedge through the Allied armies. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen. The speed shocked the world. But this was not luck or better equipment. What crushed the Allies in 1940 was a system of tactics refined through years of ruthless experimentation. These tactics would dominate the early war, reshape modern warfare, and push the German army to the gates of Moscow. This is the story of every tactic Germany used in World War II. Auftragstaktik, mission command. The foundation of German tactical success was invisible. It existed not in weapons or formations, but in how decisions were made. Auftragstaktik, or mission command, rejected the rigid top-down control that dominated other armies. German commanders did not issue detailed step-by-step orders. Instead, they gave subordinates a clear objective, explained the intent, and then trusted them to decide how to achieve it. A battalion commander did not wait for permission when an opportunity appeared. He acted, knowing his superiors expected initiative, not obedience. This system created speed that other armies could not match. During the invasion of France, German armored spearheads frequently advanced faster than their own maps could be updated. Radio reports lagged behind reality. Courier motorcycles arrived with orders for positions already abandoned. Yet units kept moving because junior officers were trained to exploit gaps immediately rather than hold position and request orders. In several cases, panzer divisions crossed rivers and seized bridges, hours before higher headquarters even realized the crossings were possible. While French commanders waited for orders from Paris, German lieutenants were already making decisions that shaped the entire campaign. By the time French generals understood what was happening, the battle had already moved 50 kilometers ahead. The real power of Auftragstaktik emerged when communications broke down. And communications always broke down. Radio equipment failed. Artillery destroyed command posts. Advancing units outran their signal cables. In Poland and France, German units often fought for entire days with minimal contact with higher command, yet still advanced in the correct operational direction. The system did not rely on perfect coordination. It relied on shared understanding. Every German officer understood the overall plan. When chaos erupted, and chaos always erupted, they could adapt without waiting for new orders. This gave the German army a flexibility that bewildered opponents still dependent on centralized control. Schwerpunkt, concentration of force. While other armies tried to be strong everywhere, the German army deliberately chose to be overwhelming in one place. Schwerpunkt, the principle of concentration of force, meant identifying the single point where a breakthrough would cause the greatest collapse, then concentrating everything there: armor, artillery, infantry, engineers, air support, all focused on one narrow sector, often at the expense of other parts of the front. German commanders accepted risk elsewhere in order to achieve decisive superiority at the chosen point. At Sedan in May 1940, this principle produced results that seemed impossible. The German army was outnumbered overall by Allied forces. The French and British fielded more tanks, more artillery pieces, and more divisions. Yet at the critical crossing point on the Meuse River, German commanders achieved local superiority of 7-1 in tanks and artillery. On a front that stretched hundreds of kilometers, German forces compressed their striking power into a sector less than 10 kilometers wide. 3 panzer divisions, over 1,200 tanks, hundreds of artillery pieces, the entire weight of the Luftwaffe's dive bomber fleet, all aimed at a handful of French bunkers and pillboxes defending the river crossings. Within 24 hours, the defenses cracked. Within 48 hours, the French front fractured. German armor poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. The real power of Schwerpunkt was not just physical force, but psychological shock. Once a breakthrough occurred, enemy commanders often reacted too slowly. They reinforced secondary sectors instead of sealing the rupture. They sent reserves to quiet parts of the front, while the crisis exploded elsewhere. German units exploited this hesitation, pushing deeper and widening the gap before a coherent response could form. But Schwerpunkt demanded precise judgment. Choosing the wrong point could waste elite units and expose weak flanks. It required commanders who could read the battlefield, identify vulnerability, and commit reserves at exactly the right moment. For 3 years, German commanders possessed this skill, and for 3 years, their enemies paid the price. Bewegungskrieg, mobile warfare. Bewegungskrieg, mobile warfare, was the engine that turned breakthroughs into victories. The German army understood that once a front stabilized, advantages in initiative and decision-making rapidly disappeared. Movement was not a phase of combat, it was the combat itself. After a breakthrough, German armored and motorized formations pushed forward immediately, even when flanks were exposed. The goal was to keep the enemy reacting, denying them time to regroup, resupply, or establish coherent defenses. Speed mattered more than security. During Operation Barbarossa in 1941, German panzer groups advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks, often bypassing enemy strongpoints rather than destroying them. Soviet units found themselves outmaneuvered, encircled, or cut off, not because they were defeated in direct battle, but because the front had shifted faster than their command structure could adapt. German logistics planning reflected this philosophy. Supply units followed rapidly moving spearheads, sometimes operating at the very edge of sustainable range. Commanders accepted logistical strain as a calculated risk, believing that operational momentum mattered more than perfect supply conditions. In the short term, this gamble worked. Entire Soviet armies collapsed before fuel shortages or mechanical failures forced German units to pause. The enemy was always reacting, always one step behind. But Bewegungskrieg carried inherent dangers: continuous movement, exhausted crews, and wore-down vehicles. When the initial shock wore off, especially on the Eastern Front in late 1941, the same mobility that enabled rapid advances became a vulnerability, breakthrough, and exploitation. For the German army, breaking through an enemy front was never the end of an operation. It was only the beginning. Once a breach was achieved at the Schwerpunkt, doctrine demanded immediate exploitation. Armored and motorized units were ordered to push through the gap without waiting for infantry to fully secure the flanks. The objective was to drive deep into the enemy's rear areas, targeting command posts, supply depots, rail junctions, and bridges. These were not symbolic targets. They were the nervous system of an army in the field. After crossing the Meuse at Sedan on May 13, 1940, German panzer divisions did not pause to consolidate their bridgeheads. They advanced westward at extraordinary speed, covering more than 300 kilometers in less than 2 weeks. The 1st Panzer Division reached the English Channel at Abbeville on May 20th, just 7 days after crossing the river. French reserves, still moving toward what they believed was the main front, suddenly found themselves cut off from orders, fuel, and ammunition. Entire formations became combat ineffective without being decisively defeated in battle. Orders arrived too late. Counterattacks were launched in the wrong direction. Commanders lost awareness of where their own front lines even were. German planners understood that modern armies could survive heavy losses, but they could not survive the destruction of command and logistics. A division could fight without replacements. It could not fight without orders or fuel. Exploitation units frequently operated far ahead of friendly forces, accepting isolation and risk. When successful, the rewards were decisive. The battle was decided not at the front line, but far behind it. While French infantry still held their positions along the Meuse, German tanks were already capturing the headquarters that controlled them. Kesselschlacht, encirclement, and annihilation. The ultimate goal of German offensive operations was not to push the enemy back, but to destroy them as a fighting force. This was achieved through Kesselschlacht, literally cauldron battle, the tactic of encirclement and annihilation. Kesselschlacht combined breakthrough, rapid exploitation, and coordinated movement to seal enemy forces inside a pocket. Once surrounded, trapped units were cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and command. German doctrine emphasized that a fully encircled army no longer needed to be defeated tactically. Time, hunger, and confusion would finish the job. The scale of these operations was unprecedented. During Operation Barbarossa in 1941, German forces executed multiple massive encirclements. At Minsk, over 300,000 Soviet troops were surrounded. At Smolensk, another 300,000. At Kiev in September, roughly 600,000 Soviet troops were captured or destroyed, one of the biggest single losses in military history. The outer ring of the encirclement, the fast-moving panzer units, had to close quickly, while slower infantry divisions followed to tighten the pocket. Any delay risked allowing the enemy to break out. German commanders constantly balanced aggression with timing. Psychologically, encirclement was devastating. Units inside the pocket often lost contact with higher command within hours. Conflicting orders, lack of ammunition, and fuel shortages spread panic. Even well-equipped formations frequently collapsed before their combat power was fully exhausted. Entire armies disappeared, not because they were outmatched everywhere, but because they were trapped at exactly the wrong moment. Close air support. One of the most underestimated German tactics was how closely air power was integrated with ground operations. For the German army, aircraft were not an independent strategic arm. They were tools to shape the battlefield directly in front of advancing troops. Unlike the Allied emphasis on long-range strategic bombing, the Luftwaffe focused on immediate battlefield effects. Dive bombers such as the Ju-87 Stuka were assigned to specific army units, responding to requests from the front rather than following pre-planned target lists. This allowed German commanders to apply air power precisely where resistance was strongest or where momentum risked stalling. The psychological impact was as important as physical destruction. Stuka attacks were timed to coincide with ground assaults, creating the impression of overwhelming force. The aircraft's sirens, deliberately designed to terrorize, combined with the thunder of explosions and the roar of approaching tanks. Defenders faced not separate threats, but one continuous assault. During the 1940 campaign in France, concentrated dive bombing against river crossings and defensive strongpoints caused multiple Allied units to abandon prepared positions before German infantry even arrived. At Sedan, waves of Stukas attacked French bunkers for hours, while German engineers prepared crossing equipment at the river's edge. French defenders, subjected to constant bombing without respite, often broke before German troops reached their positions. German forward air controllers operated near the front lines using radios to direct strikes in near real time. This coordination was rare in 1939 and gave German formations a responsiveness their opponents struggled to match. Air attacks could suppress artillery, break counterattacks, or seal breakthroughs within minutes. The enemy was not facing tanks or aircraft alone, but a single system applying pressure from the ground and the sky at the same moment. However, close air support required air superiority and favorable weather. As the war progressed, increasing Allied fighter strength and improved anti-aircraft defenses sharply reduced Luftwaffe effectiveness. By 1943, German ground forces often advanced without reliable air cover, losing a key advantage that had defined early victories: infiltration and disruption. While German offensives are remembered for tanks and sweeping maneuvers, one of their most destabilizing tactics relied on something quieter. Infiltration and disruption meant bypassing strongpoints instead of attacking them directly. German assault units, often supported by engineers and light infantry, slipped through weakly held sectors, forests, or gaps between units. Their targets were not frontline troops, but the structures that allowed an army to function: command posts, signal centers, supply columns, road junctions. During the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, relatively small German formations penetrated deep behind Soviet lines, severing communications and creating confusion far greater than their numbers suggested. Entire Soviet divisions sometimes continued to fight, unaware that their headquarters had already been captured or destroyed. Once communications failed, enemy commanders were forced to rely on outdated orders or local improvisation. Counterattacks were launched without coordination. Reserves moved in the wrong direction. Frontline units hesitated, unsure whether they were advancing into friendly territory or isolation. German planners understood that confusion multiplies faster than casualties. A small unit appearing unexpectedly behind the front could trigger panic even if its actual combat power was limited. The perception of encirclement frequently mattered more than its reality. Soviet units that could have held their positions for days sometimes retreated within hours after losing contact with higher command. Elastic defense. As the strategic balance shifted against Germany, the army increasingly relied on defensive methods designed to trade space for time. Elastic defense aimed to absorb an enemy attack, disrupt it, and then strike back at the moment of weakness. Forward positions were lightly held, intended to delay and channel the attacker rather than stop them outright. As enemy forces advanced, they became stretched, disorganized, and exposed to artillery and counterattacks. German reserves, held back deliberately, were then committed to restore the line or inflict maximum damage before pulling back again. This approach reached its most refined form on the Eastern Front in 1943. During battles following Kursk, German commanders such as Manstein used elastic defense to blunt numerically superior Soviet offensives. Soviet units often advanced into areas that appeared weak, only to be met by concentrated artillery fire and mobile counterattacks against their flanks. In several engagements, Soviet formations suffered heavy losses despite gaining ground. Timing was everything. Elastic defense depended on disciplined coordination between forward units, artillery, and reserves. Retreating too early risked losing key terrain. Retreating too late risked encirclement. German units were trained to disengage under pressure, a skill many armies struggled to master under fire. However, elastic defense required mobility and experienced troops. As German forces lost tanks, fuel, and veteran personnel, the tactic became harder to execute. What once created flexibility slowly became improvisation, without resources. Defense, in depth. By the later stages of World War II, the German army faced an uncomfortable reality. Outnumbered and outgunned, they turned to a defensive method designed to absorb overwhelming pressure without collapsing. Defense in depth. Defense in depth rejected the idea of holding a single, continuous front line. German commanders organized multiple defensive layers stretching kilometers behind the front. The first line was intentionally weak, meant to delay and identify the main axis of attack. Behind it lay stronger positions, artillery zones, anti-tank defenses, and reserve formations ready to engage once the attacker had committed fully. Soviet offensives often achieved rapid initial gains, penetrating the forward defenses within hours. But as they advanced, resistance intensified. Tanks entered pre-sighted kill zones where German anti-tank guns waited in concealed positions. Infantry faced overlapping fields of fire from positions they had not known existed. Supply lines lengthened under constant pressure from German artillery. In many cases, Soviet forces suffered heavy casualties after the breakthrough, not during it. Defense in depth aimed to buy time, not to hold territory at all costs. German planners understood they could not stop massive offensives outright, but they could slow them, bleed them, and force repeated regrouping. Every delay mattered. Hours gained at the front translated into days for reserves to reposition or for new defensive lines to be prepared farther west. However, defense in depth demanded resources Germany increasingly lacked. It required manpower to fill multiple lines, artillery ammunition to sustain prolonged fighting, and mobility to shift reserves under pressure. As Allied material superiority grew, these conditions eroded. By 1945, many depth defenses existed on maps, more than in reality. The evolution of German tactics. The story of German tactics in World War II is not simply a list of methods. It is a story of evolution and adaptation. From 1939 to 1942, German offensive tactics dominated European battlefields with a combination that seemed unstoppable. Auftragstaktik created speed and flexibility. Schwerpunkt created overwhelming local superiority. Bewegungskrieg turned breakthroughs into operational collapse. Kesselschlacht turned collapse into annihilation. Close air support and infiltration multiplied the effect of each tactic. These tactics worked because they were executed by a professional army trained for years in their application. Officers understood their intent. Soldiers trusted their leaders. The system functioned even when plans fell apart, even when communications failed, even when the enemy reacted unpredictably. But by 1943, the balance had shifted. Germany no longer possessed the resources for sustained offensive operations. Experienced officers and NCOs, the men who made Auftragstaktik function, were killed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages limited the mobility that Bewegungskrieg required. Air superiority, once assumed, was contested and then lost. The tactics that had crushed Poland, France, and much of the Soviet Union could no longer be executed at scale. The army adapted, transitioning to elastic defense and defense in depth. These defensive tactics were sophisticated, often inflicting heavy casualties on attacking forces. German commanders demonstrated remarkable skill in managing fighting withdrawals and organized retreats. But defensive tactics, no matter how skillfully applied, could not win the war. They could only delay the inevitable. Each tactical success brought days or weeks. Each encirclement avoided preserved divisions for future battles, but strategic defeat approached with mathematical certainty. By 1945, even these refined defensive methods collapsed under the weight of Allied material superiority. The tactics that made Germany unstoppable in the early years of World War II were not invincible. They were tools that required skilled operators, adequate resources, and favorable conditions. When those conditions disappeared, so did German dominance. What remains is a study in how warfare evolved during the most destructive conflict in human history, how armies adapt when initial advantages disappear, how tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic weakness, and how even the most effective tactics eventually meet their limits when facing enemies with greater numbers, greater production, and unbreakable will.